Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to C.H. Robinson's Tariff Update webinar. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode, and I would like to remind our listeners that following today's presentation, we will facilitate a review of your submitted questions. It's no secret that there has been a lot of change in the customs and trade policy world as of late, and today we'll look at which tariffs are in effect, what's coming next, what you can expect customs to be looking for in this new environment, and what you can do to mitigate risk. I'd like to remind everyone that our remarks today may contain forward-looking statements. Our information is compiled from a number of sources that, to the best of our knowledge, are accurate and correct. It is always in the intent of our company to present accurate information. At this time, I would like to turn the mic over to Ben Bidwell, our Director of U.S. Customs, and Kevin Doucette, Director of North American Trade Policy and Compliance. Ben, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I think we can all agree that it has been a very wild time within the trade industry with no real end in sight. I want to start out by providing a short recap of some of the major trade actions we have seen just in the past 8 months. In February of this year, the United States implemented Section 201 safeguard tariffs on solar cells and modules and residential washing machines. While this had a major impact to solar and washing machine importers, the broader trade was left unaffected. Move to March of this year, and Section 232 national security tariffs were placed on steel and aluminum. This had a much broader impact to the trade and continues to be a very contentious issue. While these tariffs were almost shocking at the time, fast forward to the implementation of Section 301 tariffs for goods being imported into the United States of Chinese origin. This impact has been felt across the trade in varying degrees, but certainly relatable to almost all companies that import from China. Section 301 came about on August 17, 2017, when the United States Trade Representative opened an investigation on China's business practices as related to technology transfer, intellectual property, and innovation. Keeping up with all of these moving parts can be a challenge. Between Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs, there have been multiple dates of implementation, affected countries, and varying duty rates. Let's touch on some of the key dates throughout the year. March 23rd kicked off Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, excluding, however, the EU, Mexico, and Canada. Moving forward to June 1st, steel and aluminum were now subject to the additional 232 tariffs of these countries. Our trading partners did not stand idly by, though. China, Mexico, Turkey, Russia, Canada, and the EU all put retaliatory tariffs into place between April and July of this year to varying degrees. India has announced retaliatory tariffs which may go into effect November 2nd. The first action on Section 301 unfair trade practices were implemented in the U.S. on July 6th and placed a 25% additional tariff on $34 billion worth of Chinese origin goods imported into the U.S. The first list of products had been dubbed List 1. China subsequently responded back on July 6th, imposing tariffs of their own on U.S. goods being imported into China and matched the $34 billion. On August 23rd, the United States continued Section 301 actions and instituted another 25% tariff on $16 billion worth of Chinese origin goods being imported into the U.S., dubbed List 2. Again, China responded immediately, matching tariffs on $16 billion worth of U.S. goods on the same day. Is anyone seeing a pattern here? That brings us to today. Well, technically Monday of this week. As you are likely very aware, on Monday, September 24th, the U.S. imposed another tariff of 10% on roughly $200 billion worth of Chinese origin goods being imported into the U.S. And again, China retaliated with additional tariffs on $60 billion worth of U.S. origin goods. This latest tariff, dubbed List 3, targeted a total of 5,745 harmonized tariff numbers. If no progress is made between the U.S. and China in regards to trade relations, List 3 will raise to 25% on January 1st of next year. Lastly, the U.S. threatened to implement an additional tariff on $267 billion worth of Chinese origin goods, dubbed List All, However, there has not been any mention of a timeline. If this final list were to be implemented, the U.S. would essentially be placing Section 301 tariffs on all imported goods of Chinese origin to the U.S. Now let's talk about customs enforcement. Customs has started a trade remedy unit to keep up with all of these changes and the enforcement of these changes. Similarly, in the last few years, CBP has been successful as they implemented a group to focus on the evasion of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Through this group, they have initiated 20 Enforce and Protect Act investigations, conducted 18 foreign on-site verifications, and prevented the evasion of more than $50 million annually in anti-dumping and countervailing duty. This was stated by Executive Assistant Commissioner Brenda Smith of CBP's Office of Trade at the recent CBP Trade Symposium. And we are expecting CBP to handle the enforcement of these safeguard tariffs in the same targeted fashion. Customs typically begins their inquiries in the standard fashion by requesting additional information via a CBP 28 and requesting additional documentation on the entry. You want to ensure that your compliance documentation is in place and avoid any potential penalties, which could be up to 3 times the value of the goods. Part of customs enforcement is ensuring that the importer's bond is sufficient. The bond amount for importation is 10% of the expected duty, taxes, and fees to be paid within the next calendar year. We are seeing customs issue an increased number of notices of insufficient bonds. However, at the same time, customs is behind in issuing these notices. Some importers are having entries rejected until they can get a new bond into place. In the current environment, this could take longer since sureties are requesting current financial statements and in some cases letter of credits, i.e. collateral, based on the increased exposure and risk due to the high bond amounts. I cannot stress enough the importance around making certain that bond is and stays sufficient. Failure to do so can result in CBP rendering your bond insufficient, meaning that you cannot import until a sufficient bond is in place. So what have the effects been? As you can see from some recent statistics shared by Mr. Robert Perez, Acting Deputy Commissioner, CBP, there are real dollars of impact here. In July alone, CBP collected $1.6 billion in Section 232 duties and $200 million in Section 301 duties. While the duties collected under Section 301 appear low, the only Section 301 tariffs effective in July were on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, and this is only 1 month's worth of data. As a broker, we regularly see CF-28s and CF-29s issued by Customs to our importers. There has certainly been an increase since these tariffs have taken effect, and we expect that trend to continue. Additionally, many importers are applying for direct payment with CBP via ACH and periodic monthly statement due to the higher amounts of duty now owed to CBP. This is the current environment. But what everyone wants to know is, what can I, as an importer, do, or what should I be doing? With that, I will turn it over to Kevin Doucette.
Thank you, Ben. Well, Ben had laid a great groundwork of what's currently happening with this trade war. As most companies out there want to listen about what they can do in regards to limiting exposure. First and foremost, you need to identify your risk and exposure to both the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs as well as the Section 301. What we would suggest is that you internally grab data that shows what products you're importing that would be affected by both of these regulatory issues. You should review that data and look at the volumes of imports you're having and the duty rate of tariffs that are going to be affected. You should also be looking at both the direct and an indirect impact to your organization. What I mean by that is although you might be purchasing goods domestically, those domestic goods could ultimately be imported from China by your current suppliers. Therefore, you could have an indirect impact of increased pricing on components, finished goods, raw materials, etc. You want to review your tariff classifications and your import data. The way to review this data and obtain this data is to work with your business partners, your brokers in most circumstances, to pull an accurate list of your exposure over the last 12 months. Additionally, if you are aware of other information in regards to trends as an importer that you're going to see in the next year, you would want to include that information as well. Furthermore, it's very important that you stay in direct communication with your elected officials and with your given trade associations, as they can have an impact in regards to comment periods and public hearings that have existed and will continue to exist. So what can you do once you obtain this data? First and foremost, it's very important that you review your current harmonized tariff classifications to ensure that those tariff classifications are correct. If you have the opportunity or are uncertain about the classification, it's actually recommended that you obtain an advocacy binding ruling through U.S. Customs for that tariff. Now, many companies have been doing this process over the last 6 months, been reviewing their tariffs ever since the 232 was announced, as well as the list for 301. I'd like to caution you here. Changing a tariff affects your compliance for the previous 5 years. If you change a tariff classification, you are actually obligated to do a prior disclosure to U.S. Customs and report back all transactions that have occurred in the last 5 years in regards to how much additional duty you owed and interest on those previous entries. Furthermore, if you are handling or doing a prior disclosure, it's very important that you take a thorough review of your entire compliance program, including valuation, quantities, free trade agreements, related party transactions, etc. Because if you're doing a prior disclosure, you want to capture all of those issues in the one disclosure that you would submit. Now, there are all other opportunities you can do to mitigate these additional duties we're seeing. There is the opportunity for drawback under Section 301 lists. So items that were brought in under Section 301, you were using those for a manufacturing process, or if it was a direct import to re-export out without any further substantiation, transformation, or change to the products, you can claim drawback on the duties that were paid under 301. However, that is not the case under Section 232 tariffs. So under Section 232, aluminum and steel that's imported in the country and ultimately exported, you are unfortunately not able to claim drawback on those tariffs for 232, only for 301. There's the opportunity of taking advantage of a bonded facilities and doing customs bonded warehouse entries. Customs bonded warehouse entries would allow you to import the product, reside in the bonded warehouse, and if at such times that you make a consumption or warehouse withdrawal entry, if the 301 tariffs have been eradicated, you would not have to pay the additional duties. That is for customs bonded warehouse entries only. In regards to FTZs, in regards to an FTZ, product brought in under 232 or Section 301 have to be entered under a privileged status into the FTZ. Basically what that means is at the time of arrival, if the lists are in place, the product goes into the FTZ at a privileged status, and duty would be owed at the time of a formal entry out of the FTZ into the U.S. commerce. However, you can manufacture products within the FTZ under 301 duties and directly export that product out, of the country from the FTZ, and you would not have to pay that additional duties. Very important, and unfortunately the public comment period is complete for Section 1, 2, and 3. However, Ben previously spoke about the possibility of a all Chinese goods tariff. President Trump has mentioned this, that this is a possible additional effect that could take place, and I would assume if it follows in the similar process that we've done with Section 1, 2, and 3, there would be a public comment period and hearings on those additional tariffs. This is an assumption on my part, as there has not been a release on how that would be handled, but if it does come out to play in the same process, it's very important that you actively participate in those public hearings and notices. Some other examples of things you can look at. You could look at multi-country manufacturing options. What we mean by this is reviewing your current manufacturing process that's occurring in China and seeing if you can further that manufacturing in a third country where the product would be substantially transformed and therefore take on the country of origin of that third country. This is an extremely daunting task, and what I would explain and highly suggest you do is to request a binding ruling on country of origin before going down this road too deeply. Okay? Additionally, procurement should be actively seeking alternative country sourcing options. Once again, this is additionally a very daunting task, as in many cases, capacity as well as labor and facilities to manufacture in third countries might not be a viable solution. However, it is a solution that you should look into. In addition, you can apply for an exclusion. The exclusion process for Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs require that you log on to regulations.gov and reference the docket number for the specific item you are attempting to exclude. The way that the exclusion would be completed on regulations.gov, you're required to complete the request for exclusion from remedies form for either the steel or the aluminum. Identify the detailed commodity information, including all physical properties, dimensions, descriptive terms and phrases. So, for example, hot rolled or seamless, etc. Identify and provide the chemical composition, performance data, countries of origin, export, manufacturer, and supplier of the items subject to the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. If there is any U.S. manufacturing that can make same or similar substitute of the imported commodity or product, you are required to also explain that as well. To date, there have been 17,380 steel exclusion requests filed and over 3,025 aluminum exclusion requests filed. As of Monday, the 24th of September, the number of exclusions granted are 990 exclusions for aluminum and 2,844 exclusions for steel. So exclusions are occurring. There are a lot of requests out there, and the majority of them have not been actioned to date by Customs, but they are currently working through that workload as we speak. Additionally, under Section 301, you can also do an exclusion request. Okay? The exclusion requests for List 1 are due by October 9th, 2018. Exclusion requests for List 2 must be completed by December 18th, 2018. An exclusion request for List 3 and the deadline as well as docket number for List 3 have not been communicated yet. I would strongly suggest that you keep a close eye on both your Federal Register notices as well as customs advisories that you might be receiving from your providers in regards to how the List 3 exclusion request will need to be completed. Thus far, under List 1 exclusion requests, there have been 1,622 requests filed and 224 public comments. We have not had any indication on how many have been approved to date. List 2 exclusion requests. Once again, in order to apply for exclusions under Section 301, there are specific requirements that have to be followed. You will once again, similar to Section 232, have to apply for the exclusion request via regulations.gov. You need to provide a detailed description of the item or items that you're requesting for the exclusion. You'll have to provide the correct 10-digit harmonized tariff code that's applicable for the items. You're going to have to provide information regarding the ability of customs to administer the exclusion. You will have to provide information on the annual quantity and value of Chinese origin product that you have purchased over the last 3 years, or estimate if it's unknown or unavailable. You'll have to provide a percentage of your gross sales in 2017 for the product you are looking to exclude. Address whether or not the product or comparable is available from other sources in the United States or third countries. And disclose if there are severe economic harm could occur to your business if these duties remain in effect for your particular items. That concludes our prepared comments. I will turn it back to Marcus, who will answer some of the questions we received from the participants.
Thanks, Kevin. And first, I'd like to take a moment to thank those of you who submitted questions. I'll be framing up the questions just as they were submitted and turn it over to Kevin and Ben for a response. With that, let's dive into the first question, which I'll direct to Ben. Ben, please explain what cutoff date U.S. Customs will use to impose the new tariffs. Is it BL date, ETA date, or PO date?
Thank you, Marcus. Great question, and one that we certainly hear a lot. Customs does base the tariff date based on the arrival date. So if you had goods that were subject to List 3 301 duties that went into effect on Monday, and those goods arrived on Monday, you would unfortunately be subject to paying those duties. I know, one of the comments we hear oftentimes are, can you pre-file all of our entries and submit the entry to customs before arrival, etc.? Yes, we can certainly do that. However, customs will ultimately come back and base those duties off of the arrival date and require that the broker resubmit their entry with the 301 duties applicable.
Thank you, Ben. This next one is for Kevin. Kevin, how are sets that are classified under GRI 1 handled if the set HTS is listed in the 301 list, but the component that impacts the duty rate is not in the 301 list?
Once again, a very good question. 301 tariffs are subject to the harmonized tariff code on the items that were imported in. Therefore, since the set is classifiable and is on the 301 list, it would have duty associated with that list. So, for example, if it is list 3 and this item was imported today or arrived today, you would be applicable to paying a 10% duty on that set.
Thanks, Kevin. And Ben, this one's for you. Our listeners also wanted to know what products will be affected by the new round of tariffs and what will the new rates be?
Great. Thank you, Marcus. Certainly too many commodities to just list off. However, List 1 and List 2 are both at a 25% additional duty rate and cover roughly 1,200 harmonized tariff codes. So if you'll recall, List 1 went into effect July 6th, List 2 August 23rd. Now we've got List 3, which became effective on Monday of this week, and those carry an additional duty rate of 10% until January 1st, when that can raise to 25%. List 3 does cover 5,745 harmonized tariff codes. The specific listing of affected tariff numbers are available online at ustr.gov. And C.H. Robinson also sends out regular client advisories with this type of information in detail.
Thanks, Ben. This next question is for Kevin. Kevin, if you import items for a trade show under a TIB, would you be required to pay 301 duties?
Excellent question, Marcus. If you're importing items under a TIB, a transportation and bond, you would not have to pay the 301 duties at that time, as long as you adhere to the requirements of the TIB. In other words, ensure that you're exporting the goods out within the time constraints of that TIB. Furthermore, it's important to make note here, since there would be additional duties under 301, you are going to have to increase the bond amount for the TIB to account for the 301 duties as if the goods were not actually exported out of the country. So your bond amount would have to increase to cover those 301 duties.
Thanks, Kevin. And Ben, let's go back to you. One of the viewers asked us the following question. How do we increase our bond? When List 1 and List 2 went through, my bond was sufficient to meet the additional duties, but with List 3, I'm not sure it is anymore. Looking for feedback and recommendations on what we should do.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, to go back to my earlier comments around bond sufficiency, it's certainly something to pay attention to. I think first and foremost in this particular instance, you would want to look at your impact to List 3, likely based on historical transactions or future forecasting data if that's available. Ultimately, you're going to total your entire impact by the 3 lists of the Section 301 duties as well as your regular duty outlay, and calculate 10% of that. Simply put, if your bond is less than that, you would need to work with your broker and the surety company to increase your bond. Depending on the existing usage of your bond, you may not need an increase immediately, but this is something that should be reviewed periodically, as bond increases can take some time to implement.
Thanks, Ben. Kevin, I'll throw another question your way, and this is certainly one that we've been getting from a lot of different people. Is there even a remote possibility that both the U.S. and China will eliminate some or most of these tariffs in 2019?
For our sake, I hope there is, to tell you the truth, Marcus. But unfortunately, I'm not privy to exactly when these tariffs would be eliminated. It doesn't look good as this week compared to the fact that the Chinese delegation is not coming to negotiate these tariffs at this point in time. I hope that this does not draw out for too long. However, hope is not a strategy. Take the information we discussed today and utilize it to implement a strategy that works for your organization to reduce your risk to these tariffs.
All right, well, thank you, Ben and Kevin, for your responses, and again, thank you to those of you that submitted questions. I'm afraid with that, our time is up for today, and we'll have to conclude the Q&A portion of the webinar. We do realize that there were many other questions submitted, so we will be following up individually on those that we couldn't get to today. And for any of you that would like to revisit this material in the future, a replay of this webinar will be available at the same link tomorrow. Thank you all again for joining us.